right, everyone. Welcome to Performance Psych Musings. My name's Peter Piasecki.
And I'm David Farouk.
And welcome to PPM or Performance Psych Musings. This channel or this podcast, if you will, is everything to do with performance psych. So we will be exploring some of the research that myself and Dave, what we're conducting and the topics we're interested in. And that could be anywhere from sport, from exercise, performance contexts, emerging topics that we're coming across in our own research. We're sort of just seeing where this goes and sharing some of the information that we're gathering in our own sort of journeys. And we would like to translate it to the general population. So it could be used for a lay person or for other researchers or graduate students or people interested in this field. Just to start off, I'll share a little bit about myself. So I'm currently a PhD student at Boston University. My research is focused on areas of group dynamics, predominantly leadership and cohesion, team building interventions, things like that. I'm also engaged in mindfulness and meditation research, which is one of my passions. And most recently, with my psychology background, I'm interested in like human flourishing and ultimately how an individual can live a healthy, well life. And what are some of the things individuals can do to get to a place of flourishing in their lives. So that's a little bit about me. I'll let Dave share a little bit about himself.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Pete. So me and Piotr started PhD right about the same time. So we've kind of been sharing a lot of experiences kind of side by side. And my research is around flow states, as kind of popularized by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. And I'm sort of taking an ecological dynamics perspective on flow states. So a lot about sort of performer environment adaptivity. I'm really interested in co-adaptation. So the way that people adapt to performance contexts, given the fact that there are other performers, obviously, who are doing the same, right? So I'm kind of using this term co-adaptation, I think, to kind of transcend competition and cooperation, because, you know, there's sort of those multiple things going on at the same time. I think I like that term to kind of capture that. Also really interested in sort of attention, anticipation, creativity, and a lot of the things that, you know, really kind of draw us to sport, both as participants and, you know, as entertainment, as, you know, watching, you know, skilled athletes play. So those are some of the things that are kind of pushing my interest forward. And I'm also just really interested in kind of sport at, you know, a kind of a more zoomed out or an ontological level. Like, what is it? You know, why do we do it? I think it's a really strange phenomenon that maybe we don't think about at that level, just because it is kind of part of our lives. So yeah, I'm interested in psychology and sport, but also, you know, the role that sport plays kind of in that kind of general psychological picture, sociological picture as well.
Nice. Yeah. I feel like every time you talk about the purpose of sport in our lives, and like, living in America, it's interesting to see the impact that it has. Like, the basic sport of, it's not a basic sport, but the biggest sport in America arguably is American football, and how that impacts so many people's lives. I'm wondering, how'd you pursue that interest? Like, where did it initially start for you?
So it goes back, you know, to playing personally. Me and Peter played soccer together in college, university level. So playing, but then afterwards coaching. So coaching youth level, grassroots level soccer. struggling not to say football, being here in the UK. But yeah, coaching, I think seeing like when kids just kind of get into it, you can just see that point when something just kind of clicks and they just become obsessed with a sport. I mean, of course, there's always cases that people speak about where the parents are, maybe helicopter parents or living vicariously. But a lot of cases that I saw and the way that I experienced it when I was younger as well was just very organic. Sometimes the parents didn't seem to be that bothered about whether their kids did or didn't play, but the kids themselves were just like absolutely obsessed. And I just always thought that was really interesting. And kind of the fact that sport does emerge, globally across so many different contexts, times and places, really different, lifestyles and organizations of society, sport seems to be quite universal across all those. So kind of what it was that's kind of making that continually reemerge was always a big question for me. And obviously Csikszentmihalyi is kind of asking a lot of those questions as well. So I think that was where there's kind of a confluence.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Just thinking about some of the work that I've done in sports psychology and like particularly like adolescence, and then you see like you were saying how like regardless of parents, sometimes kids just find this greater meaning in sport. But then I always think about like the car ride home with the parent that is like living vicariously through their kid. And I think that is more so, and I guess that's, I might be biased, but that's like a North American thing of parents pushing their kids and wanting to live through their kids to pursue professional sports. And whether that's this professionalization of youth sport in America being like, I'm not 100% sure if it's $1 billion business, but I know it's $1 million business, like youth sport. And you could speak to that more because you've done some coaching. Because only coaching I've done was at the university level for like 1 year. But yeah, like, I guess with your experience now coaching in the UK, like apart from the research that you do, like from the applied perspective, what are some of the differences you've noticed from like the American sort of framework and the UK framework?
That's a really good question. So I think it probably does depend, I think, on the sport. But what I've kind of noticed, because I am coaching, I have an under-8 team here, is that football or soccer, as they say, it works closer to how American football works in the US. So you wouldn't necessarily meet someone in the US, except maybe at a high school level or above, right, who is an American football coach. Like if you go to, what do they call it, Pee Wee football? Is that what it's called?
I believe
the young
so.
kids, right? The young kids is going to be dads mostly. You might have like a couple people from the organization kind of facilitating, but it's kind of so much ingrained in the culture that there aren't, at the younger levels, I think, I mean, there's obviously coaches and teams and that, but I think it's actually not in the UK quite as serious at the younger ages from what I've seen. I think that was kind of interesting to me, having coached in the US some like absolutely mind-bogglingly talented like young teams, which there's now of course a lot of ethical concerns over that. I'd like to think that the teams I was involved in, there wasn't any kind of toxic culture or anything going on, but there was always concerns about early specialization and stuff like that. So I think when you do have kind of across the whole culture a lot more structures to support like across whole developmental time period, you've got like lower level professional leagues are a lot more common and stuff here. So I think there's just maybe more pathways later on, but I think it's actually seemed a little bit more laid back in terms of the younger ages.
Yeah, because from how I understand it, it's not like here, for example, in Boston, you look at youth you're like, okay, you could Google 12-year-old soccer, right? And I can imagine you'll come across like a few academies and like a few clubs or travel teams just in one metropolitan area, right? But would you agree, or is the system much different than that in England?
It's hard for me to speak really generally, but I think where I'm in the north, in Sheffield, it's a relatively big metropolitan area. I think it's about 600,000. There are actually not quite as many teams as I anticipated that there would be at those younger ages. But then at the top level, obviously you've got more academies. I think the grassroots level, I think there's just a lot of general participation. But I think, kind of getting back to your original point, I think you do see kind of the North American striving, as it kind of comes into youth sport. Maybe it's kind of a sociocultural constraint. Personally, I don't think it's 100% negative. I think there's pros and cons to both of those. Yeah,
no, I agree with that. Yeah, that's just interesting. I mean, yeah, I can imagine some of the things you have seen, like just like approaches taken from the athletes you've worked with, where you are now, and the differences of where you have been, right? That's awesome. Yeah, does like I can imagine your sort of research interest in flow and sort of the greater meaning of sport. Like, is that like a continuous thought process while you're coaching as well?
It is. I think that's actually been something sometimes occasionally difficult to navigate. It's kind of the intersection of academic interests and then kind of interacting with different environments as well. I think there's times where I'm kind of tempted to just keep it separate. I think, for example, the organization that I'm coaching within, I've had a couple conversations with people, but I try not to kind of push, my research or what's kind of associated with my research and kind of the academic line of thinking. I try to keep it organic, if people ask about it. But yeah, given that it's kind of a grassroots club, I'm mostly just kind of doing it to stay involved in the sport. But I've had a couple conversations with people who kind of asked, kind of stuff. A lot of what I'm looking at right now is attacker defender dyads. So like I was mentioning, co-adaptation. So, in almost all the invasion games, you see those little fluctuations when, one player is trying to go past or, defend from the other side. You get those little fluctuations, right? So that's a lot of my research is kind of around that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think there's definitely applications, but it's just kind of picking and choosing when to kind of let those interact.
Yeah, that's interesting. So attacker defender. So they're looking from an opponent perspective, right? Dyads.
Yeah.
That's interesting. When you were saying dyads, I was thinking of like the new sort of essentially individual zones of optimal functioning 2.0, the shared zones of optimal functioning, where they look at like dyads and how synced they are in the task at hand, right? And I think in sport, particularly football, soccer, it would be like, I don't know, for example, what would be a good dyad? I mean, back in the day, it would be like Messi and Xavi, right? It would be a dyad, right? And it would be interesting to see if, like, looking at their brain waves using like neurofeedback to see if their brain waves sort of sync up, like in the same rhythm when it comes to shared zones of optimal functioning. And there's more to that sort of theoretical framework. But I wonder, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are on like the opponent. Like, do you think there's a syncing that happens there? Because it's like if you will, the dance, right? That happens Yeah, what are
that's actually a lot of kind of what I'm looking at. But sort of to step back, and I think this probably has implications for performance psych more broadly. I found it really interesting that flow has always been studied, to the best of my knowledge, unless something's snuck by me, but it's always been studied largely in individuals, and then occasionally in teams, right? So if you're experiencing flow yourself, or perhaps as a group that's acting cooperatively, even within competition, but we're on the same team, right? Like you're saying. So there might be various types of synchronization, that people will say, oh, I knew I was going to run, right? You kind of have good chemistry, right? But there's not been, that I've seen anything that looks at experience across that competitive boundary. And for me, that is a pretty big gap. And I think it's kind of interesting to think about why that is. And I think that's why I'm trying to use this term co-adaptation rather than just competition, because I think competition for some people has a more of an antagonistic or a hostile connotation to it. But I think for me, it's been kind of slept on as a way of knowing somebody. Because when you do compete, or as I would say, co-adapt, right? Well, first of all, you've got to have sort of agreed to have this interaction, right? You've both come into this game setting, but it's quite a really close relationship in a certain way in terms of kind of the dynamics of it, right? You're very tightly coupled, and not to get too technical, but there's different types of couplings, but the coupling that happens like in an attacker defender dyad, it does sort of self-organize towards a certain point, we call it a critical point, and that's where you kind of see those fluctuations start to happen, right? But I've always felt like those relationships or interactions, you get really close to someone in in a metaphorical sense, not so much in terms of physical proximity, where you kind of have a sense of how someone thinks through the way that they move. And sort of a silly little example is if you're walking on a sidewalk or in a hallway, you try to go opposite and you get stuck into that wiggle walk, right? And people always kind of chuckle, right? But you can kind of see, first of all, you experience yourself kind of being sucked into that, right? But you can kind of see how somebody thinks, right? Because they're actively deciding which way to go. You're actively deciding, and you become kind of coupled into that. So, all that to say, I think there is a lot to understand about, relating to others through competition as maybe construed as co-adaptation.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And you will be actively observing and collecting data in the near future, or are you currently?
Yeah, we've done a little pilot work. We've got some more pilot work, and then we'll be collecting, within the next couple of months. So we've got sort of an attacker defender activity set up, using some motion capture.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Daunting but exciting.
What?
I said daunting. It's it's always a lot the first time through, but
yeah, that pilot, it's like you're working out the kinks of the whole study. That's cool. That definitely can, not only like the dynamics of flow, but the idea of competition, like it will speak to that. I can imagine the findings that come out of the study, which is awesome.
Yeah, so tell me a little bit about how you got interested in team cohesion, many of the other things that you're researching as well.
Yeah, so long story, but it's I'll sort of share like the most influential transitions that I've experienced throughout my life that sort of speak to my research. It wasn't as linear as some people experience sort of linear progression. I think it's, when it comes to research, sometimes it's difficult because you're just exploring. It's curiosity, based off of maybe lived experiences. But so for me, it was, I always say it's funny because I always say my education started in grad school. My undergrad education, I did not take seriously at all. I literally went to undergrad to play soccer. And the plan was to continue playing soccer. And I mean, I wouldn't be here if I did continue playing soccer. So, but I am grateful for the game, that's for sure, because it got me some great experiences. But it's the reason why I got interested in team cohesion was because of what I have experienced in the game of soccer, where I've been a part of many teams that were extremely cohesive, like had a high sort of perception of cohesion, each individual. And then I had teams that were horrible, just like, and I think a lot of those dynamics were influenced by the leadership. So maybe a lack of leadership, maybe the leadership style. Yeah, so leadership style could be anything from, I mean, if you look at the leadership literature, like autocratic, right? Or just laissez-faire type of leadership, so I feel like I've experienced a lot of that, a lot of different types. And then when I found myself having the opportunity to pursue a master's, and this was in Canada, I've just jumped into cohesion and group dynamics literature. So, and when it comes to team sports, I think, I mean, one of the most important things a team can do to improve their outcomes, right, is to be a cohesive team, right? And I don't mean like they just have to be extremely social together off the pitch or off the court, right? But the most important thing, do they have task cohesion, right? Because I can imagine you would drive around to these professional clubs, walk into the locker room, and I'm like 100% sure you wouldn't see everyone being socially cohesive out of performance, right? And that's okay, right? But if there's that task cohesion, it's important, right? So how do we increase that that task cohesion? So I dove into some of the team building intervention literature and sort of looked around what has been done, what hasn't, some ideas. And then I came across mindfulness, right? And very much so from a contemplative perspective. Like, I think it was like my personal journey, sort of. I was also asking some like questions of purpose, meaning in my life, and came across like meditative practices. And it was interesting to look at the mindfulness and meditation literature in sport, because the nature of mindfulness and meditation is non-striving, right? Those are one of the tenets. And it's interesting to see that being conducted in sport when it's like everything about sport is outcome, right? Outcome oriented. So I saw sort of some dissonance there for just like reading the literature. So I was like, how about we take mindfulness and meditation, and the purpose of it to teach a team is to increase cohesion and use it as a team building intervention, right? So that was my master's thesis. Yeah, it was essentially a pilot study. I still haven't replicated it. I would like to at a bigger scale, just to see and also work out the kinks. But as grad students out there know, it's a process trying to make a perfectly controlled study, especially when it's an intervention based, and especially when you're working with a student athlete team that they're essentially doing 2 full-time jobs, and you're trying to get data or collect surveys from them. Not everything's going to go as planned, as well as scheduling. So it was challenging, but it was good. It opened my eyes to first of all, like some of the potential of mindfulness meditation. And I mean, there's a lot of research out there like trying to provide us with, whether it's a protocol, like people monetizing some of the research that they're doing. And I get that. Some people taking various approaches to it, whether it's performance enhancement, whether it's dealing with injury, whether it's just general well-being, right? So yeah, as to answer your question, this is long-winded, but to answer your question, that's how I sort of develop my interest. And now with the research that I'm doing, most recently I dove into the leadership of group dynamics and was looking at the task and social leadership qualities and what what type of research has even been done in the sport realm, particularly with peer leadership. So there's tons and tons of research looking at leadership with coaches, right? With predominantly those people who make the biggest decisions, right? But there isn't a lot of leadership research looking at peers amongst peers or athletes, right? So I was interested in cohesion, right? Both at the social cohesion and task cohesion level, and then also collective efficacy. So looking at team confidence. So what impacts do peer leaders have on those two variables, cohesion and collective efficacy? And it was interesting to see some of the literature on particularly collective efficacy, and looking at task and social peer leaders, because you would think that task leaders would have a greater impact on collective efficacy. However, that wasn't the case. It was, I mean, it wasn't a significant p-value. It was getting there. It was almost there. But I also think the amount of articles that we found, I want to say on the collective efficacy side, there were only like 4.
Wow.
That only had task and social peer leadership. So, I mean, that also tells you there has to be more research,
right,
moving forward. So hopefully maybe give it a decade and might look different. The sample sizes were like big though. So over 3,000, I believe, athletes, which is, it's always great to have that. But so, yeah, so that was actually my first qualifying task, that meta-analysis conducted for my PhD. And now moving forward, I'm going to continue focusing on mindfulness and meditation within team settings, and not necessarily looking at just like a program, because I think there's so much research on, okay, this is a protocol, we're going to see pre and post, and that's fun and all, but do we know what each exercise in that program, how that impacts the athlete or the individual, right? So I think particularly in the sport realm, I think what needs to be done is research looking at individual meditation exercises and examining the impacts, and then creating a sort of a protocol based off of the research that we found. So, and that could be like a research agenda for a whole career, right? Obviously, I don't foresee myself doing that, just focusing on that, maybe contributing a little bit, but so yeah, that's a long-winded answer, but that's sort of where I'm at in my sort of research career, if you will.
That's fascinating. I want to hone in on one thing for a minute, is the sort of college sport, right? It's obviously a subset of performance psych, but sort of that being personal to both of us. One thing that stuck out to me was when you said that in undergrad, you were essentially there to play sport, right? And I 100% resonated with that, right? That was my experience as well. Um, can you talk a little bit about what that type of context? So, the fact that we were there, and that being sort of our whole, that kind of wrapped up all of our activities, right? You've obviously got classes and all other stuff going on, right? But that as a whole, this context of being within university, um, that's sort of what you're doing with your life at that point, right? Um, can you talk a little bit about how college sports might be sort of a unique context in the sense that even compared to professional athletes, right? So much of your context is shared. And when you do have that context being so meaningfully situated within the grand scheme of a lot of those students, athletes' lives, what kind of impact does that have for both task cohesion and some of those more social aspects? So I'm guessing there's probably some negatives and positives for that, right?
Yeah, I can imagine. I don't know if they like examining that, particularly that question. That would be a great qualitative research study. But I mean, just the context of student athlete life, it definitely, I think it speaks to social cohesion a lot, because I mean, student athletes, if you're on a team, you're living together, you're eating together, you're training together. I mean, and let's be real, you're partying together, like you're doing all, like that's part of the student athlete experience. Like
Right.
you're doing all of these things together, particularly with your roommate, who's most likely also on the team that you're a
Right.
part of, right? And traveling and whatnot. You're coming to campus early, and you're experiencing all of this together. So by default, you would think, like anecdotally, just think like, I mean, anecdotally, I think that social cohesion plays a huge role. And then the task, depending on, and of course, like looking at the American context, like I think it's a little different when you looking at Division III versus Division I, right? The dedication and passion level might be there, right? But I mean, the resources aren't there. The competition might look different depending on what conference you're in. And don't get me wrong, like I think there are some D3 athletes who could probably play D1, right? And then some D1 athletes who probably shouldn't be playing on a D1 team, right? But again, I don't have that much coaching experience, but just what I've noticed throughout my time working in athletics. Because I mean, I've as a consultant, I've worked at all levels for the past 6 years. And it's just interesting, even doing sports psychology work in those environments, it's a totally different approach doing it from a D3 perspective when you're in D3 athletic department and D1 athletic department. And there's more, it's almost like there's a greater emphasis on performance enhancement at the D1 level. And just like you shift it to more so of a, like, just like a well-being wellness perspective at a D3 level. And that has been my experience, at least. So, and when you're talking about, sorry, I know you asked cohesion, task, and social, but for us, like we went through a lot during our time, and I mean, you're halfway across the world and we're still talking, and it's actually quite interesting, because Dave and I, we played on the same team, but I was a freshman, he was a senior. So we just missed each other by 3 years, but we were together for 1 year. And then like I don't know, would you call it, we were like acquaintances, I guess, to some extent at first.
Yeah.
And then when you were out of college, you stayed in the area and sort of you you would always come to open field sometimes,
Right.
particularly
Yeah.
during off season. So
Yeah.
we grew closer. But then when you mentioned that you're interested in pursuing the psychology of flow and of this idea that you mentioned with the purpose and meaning of sport, that's when I think our friendship sort of flourished, if you
Yeah.
will, and like you said earlier, we both started our PhDs at the same time. So that has sort of strengthened our relationship because
Mhm.
I think sometimes what happens when you go through being a student athlete, you have that experience, when the individuals find their different um, careers after school. Sometimes you grow apart because there's no longer that united sort of experience.
Mhm.
Like it's in the past and there's nothing that continues.
Mhm.
So for you and I, we were in that same experience on the team, right? And then time went on, and then we both were interested in the same thing, so that even strengthened our bond, if you will, right? Versus, I mean, there are some players I don't even talk to anymore, and I mean, just because we only identified ourselves with the task at hand, with being on the team, right? And that's okay, and I mean, that's fine. So I think, going back to cohesion, I think that social aspect, just the greater context that being a student athlete is a lot stronger.
Mhm.
And I mean, the classic saying, you'll forget championships and the emotional experience that you had between an individual and yourself, I think will stay just as strong moving throughout your life,
Mhm.
um there's a particular saying around that, like, um it's not what happens or something, but how that person made you feel, right?
Right.
So I think
Yeah.
that speaks to, and I actually think this probably has not been researched. This is like, a lot of this is anecdotal and some just my thoughts based off of some of the research and also some of the applied work. I guess looking at it from a scientist practitioner framework, if you want me to
Mhm.
use
Mhm.
that term. But that's interesting, and I continue, like, I continue seeing that at like the D1 level,
Mhm.
the athletic departments I'm working in currently, and that in the moment, athletes, of course, want to pursue like top level performances, right?
Mhm.
But we have to also be realistic. Like, I think it's less than 1% of people out of D1 athletic departments go professional.
Mhm.
And that's only looking at like the major league sports, right?
Mhm.
So think about like swimming and diving. How many people are gonna, from D1 athletic departments, actually going to make it to like the Olympics, right?
Mhm.
Or track and field events, right? So I can imagine that looks a lot different based off of sort of those um, less media frenzied
Right.
sports, if you will, right?
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So yeah, that was a long-winded answer, but those were some of my thoughts.
Yeah. The one thing that was coming to me from that, which college athletes will know, is just there's sort of an interesting thing that happens when you've played with someone, in that type of an intense competitive environment, that you know them in a way that it's difficult to get to know other people, short of maybe someone who you've known throughout childhood, right? But it's almost that type of a depth to it that it's hard to replicate later on, sort of with people that you meet, because it is something that was so meaningful to us. So you see people kind of at just like unbelievable highs and lows. Like I think we could remember probably, say 2011, all kind of jumping, chanting together, just sort of that euphoric. But, also the times when you see people, I don't think there's many people in the locker room who I haven't seen cry, just because it's so meaningful to people. And because you do share so much of that context, all of the events that kind of unfold, I think the meaning is also shared so closely. And I think that's always been interesting. Like, you know, when you said some points, there's just kind of task cohesion. But it's always, in some ways, is actually a little bit like family, that you're close with the people in a certain way. You know them in a certain way, even before you feel a certain way about them.
Yeah.
I always thought that was a really interesting aspect of kind of being in a group like that. And I think that is why like a lot of those relationships are so enduring.
Yeah, no, totally. I think you hit the nail on the head with that one. Where there's this euphoric, almost hive mind of like you're chanting all this stuff, this group flow, you know. And then there's the down of, I mean, just thinking about like particularly your senior year, when it's like the senior class and it's that last game, and it's just like it's total defeat. It doesn't matter what happens in the game. It's like defeat because you know this was the last experience, you know.
Right.
And that, I think that it's almost like that following that last game you have played in college, like it's pain, you know. It's like all the emotions built up over the course of the regardless if you won, you lost, conference champs, national champ, whatever, you're feeling pain that this experience is over. That's why it's such a unique experience to be to have the opportunity to be a college athlete in America, just a system, of course. And I'm not saying it's perfect, of course it's not, especially thinking about like NIL coming into and how that's going to impact the sort of the trajectory and experiences of athletes. But it is a very unique and I mean, at least in my experience, it was a great experience, regardless of like the hurt that I experienced throughout. And we had a opportunity to win a conference championship, which was pretty fun. And for the first time in the college history, make it into national, at least regionals, to try to make it to nationals, where our goalie scored a goal because we didn't. So many people were injured. Good times. But Dave, I think we were in flow because a lot of time went by as we were talking, and which is great. But I was wondering, do you have any like parting thoughts as to like what to expect from these talks, this channel, or what have you, to the people that are listening?
Yeah, so I think we kind of like to have this conversation in a way, hopefully, that invites people to kind of join in, you know, share their thoughts, you know, things that might resonate, things that might interest people to hear more about as well, and kind of to kind of be on sort of this path of exploration, kind of alongside of us. And hopefully that sparks some people's interest. And I think we'll try to kind of stay near to what's kind of keeping us interested as well. So hopefully people kind of can resonate with that, and we get some synergy going as well.
I love that. I love how you said like stay on the path of exploration with us, and like be included as to like just with like what you liked, what you didn't like, maybe what you would like to hear. I totally not to repeat what you said, but I agree with that. And we want this to be an interaction with the people who listen. Like if you're someone who's interested in the field, like you could be a coach, a player, like feel free to maybe ask some questions. That'd be awesome. But also if you're like a grad student, and there's some research that you're doing, like that's awesome. Like feel free to share that, or even if you're a veteran in the field, like, and regardless if you're on the psych side or on the kinesiology side or sports science, what have you, like we're all family. Performance psychology, we're all pursuing sort of that enhancement from various, not only an enhancement, but the understanding of the process of what does it mean to perform, right? And it doesn't have to be in sport. It could be performing arts, it could be military, it could be business, right? So just thinking about that, and we're excited to I mean, share what we're exploring, just like Dave said, and hopefully this content is meaningful, or there's at least something that resonates. And yeah, so feel free to stay tuned, and we'll catch you all guys later at a future date.